That afternoon, the Oregon light fell in a dry, tired shade of gold, the kind that settled like worn dust. On the faded wooden porch of the Holt Ranch, Marienne stood still, her hand resting on a railing with loose nails. The wind moved through the distant pines, carrying the scent of hot earth and sunburned grass, a scent she had lived with for a full year, ever since Elijah died from the sharp, unforgiving fever that took him in a single night. A year had passed, yet at times she still heard his cough drifting somewhere in the empty rooms. The garden on the left had cracked open from lack of water. The roof sagged where rain had worn it thin. Everything around her seemed tired, as if the land itself was running on its last breath. And she, strong as she tried to be, was still just one woman standing alone beneath the wide, endless sky. She was about to step back inside when she noticed a faint lift of dust on the far road. A lone rider moved toward the ranch, slow and unsteady in the late-day glare. Marienne narrowed her eyes, her fingers brushing the small hammer she kept beside the door. As the rider came closer, he took shape, tall, broad-shouldered, sitting straight in the saddle though he looked worn to the bone. His gray horse limped, each step marked by the loose click of a front shoe. The sunlight caught his road-darkened face, revealing lines carved deep, the kind made by 20 years of drifting across open country. He stopped at the porch. "Afternoon, ma'am," he said, his voice low, rough with dust. "Name's Silas Turner. My horse hit a stone, loosened the shoe. I'm only hoping for some water and directions to the nearest smith." Marienne didn't answer right away. She studied him from boots to eyes dulled by exhaustion, yet free of any threat. Only the plain truth of a worn man standing where the road placed him. "The well's behind the house," she said, guarded but not cold. "And the smith, he closed up last winter." Silas nodded and dismounted. He staggered just slightly, enough for her to see he had been on the trail far too long. She led him toward the well, the sounds of clucking hens and wind pushing through the broken stable roof, blending into the familiar quiet of a farm lived in by only one pair of hands. As the horse drank, Silas rested his palm on the well's rim and lowered his head in thanks. "Hope I'm not troubling you at this hour," he said. "It's no trouble," Marienne replied softly. In truth, she had forgotten what a man's voice sounded like in this yard. The sky was deepening into that copper shade of late dusk. Silas looked from his horse to the long road stretching west. "I should move on before dark." She glanced at the loose shoe, then at the fading sun. On that road, in this light, riding out would be nothing short of a gamble. "If you want," she said after a quiet breath, "the back stable still has room. I've got tools. I'm no smith, but I've patched enough shoes." Silas looked at her, surprise flickering in his brow. "You're sure? I don't want to be a burden." Marienne didn't answer. She simply turned and walked toward the stable. In the dimming light, they stood on either side of the horse, examining the shoe. When Silas lifted the animal's leg, Marienne steadied the knee. In that brief second, the backs of their hands brushed, a light touch that halted them both for the smallest moment. Silas glanced toward her then, really looked, at the hands hardened by work, shaped by the weight of too much responsibility. "You're used to this," he said, voice lowered. "There's no one else to do it," she answered, eyes still on the shoe. They worked without speaking, the faint ring of metal on stone and the horse's slow breathing filling the space between them. By the time Silas tightened the final nail, the daylight had thinned into a muted violet settling over the stable. Marienne brushed off her apron. Let it stand a bit. It'll be fine. Silas stayed quiet a moment, head bowed as though steadying himself after more than a trail, after a life lived in motion. He looked toward the house on the rise, where a single oil lamp glowed with thin, warm light. Something passed through his expression, small and quiet. The kind of feeling a wanderer rarely lets himself believe in. The thought of a porch where one might stop. And so their first night began in silence, but not emptiness. It held something slow and growing, a thing neither had dared name. Night settled over the yard as Marienne set the hammer on its wooden hook and led Silas up the steps. The thin door gave a soft creak when she pushed it open. Lamplight stretched across the cracked walls and the small table built for two. The space was narrow, yet kept so clean one could tell it had been tended by steady hands, not left to wear with time. "Dinner isn't much," Marienne murmured, placing a pot of stewed beans on the table. "Cornbread left over from noon." Silas removed his hat and set it on the peg by the door, as though he had done it 100 times. "After weeks of dried meat and hard bread," he said with a quiet smile, "this is a feast." Marienne lowered her gaze, hiding the small smile his honesty stirred. She filled 2 bowls with the warm beans, a simple smell spreading through the small kitchen. When she reached across the table with the ladle, her hand brushed Silas's wrist as he moved for the spoon. They stopped for half a beat, a light touch, barely there, yet enough to shift the air. "Sorry," she whispered. "It's all right," he replied, voice steady but eyes lingering for a breath longer than necessary. They ate in silence, the only sounds the light clink of spoons and the fire cracking softly in the stove. After a few minutes, Silas spoke. "I left Wyoming in June," he said, slow, as if tracing all the roads behind him. "Went through Idaho, then down here. Didn't plan much. Just wanted someplace with fewer people. It's a long road. Beautiful, but lonely." Marienne nodded. The last part stayed with her. "You traveled alone the whole way?" "Most of it. Worked with a few cattle hands now and then, but at this age I only want quiet. Less noise, fewer fights over nothing." There was a tiredness under his tone that made her glance up. The fire cast his shadow long across the wall, and in that shadow she saw a man who had carried too many years without rest. She set her spoon down. "I understand that feeling." Silas waited, giving her the space to continue. "Elijah, my husband, passed last year. Lung fever." Her voice trembled, not from fresh grief, but from speaking aloud a sorrow she had kept folded away. Silas bowed his head slightly, the fire softening his expression. "I'm sorry. He was sick for months, and years before that, we lost a child. 3 years old." The words left her like a breath she had held too long. Silas didn't reach for platitudes. He only placed his spoon aside and straightened, offering a kind of quiet respect that didn't demand she hide or explain. It wasn't pity, just presence. And that was more than she expected from a man she'd met an hour ago. The air around the table eased. Their awkwardness shifted into something warmer, gentler, as though recognizing one another's old wounds made the room less tight. Silas glanced around the house. The half-empty shelf of books, the folded blanket on the chair, the worn kitchen tools kept spotless. All of it told him just how much strength it had taken for this woman to keep her home standing. Suddenly, the wind hit the door hard, rattling it against the frame. Marienne jumped, dropping her spoon. Silas rose instantly, crossed the room, and pressed his hand against the weak spot in the wood. "Just a strong gust," he said softly, looking back at her. It was a brief moment, but the look they shared in the flicker of the fire made the small room feel one shade warmer. Marienne stood, gathering the dishes. "I'll wash these. You should rest." Silas took his hat, bowing his head with a courtesy rarely seen in men who lived on the trail. "I can sleep in the stable tonight. I'll leave early so I don't trouble you more." She walked with him to the door. "There are spare blankets in the wooden chest. Nights here are colder than they look." Silas paused, turning to her. A quiet moment held between them. Not tense, simply aware. Of the presence of another soul. Of something neither wished to name. "Thank you, Marienne Holt," he said, her full name low and steady on his tongue. When he stepped into the darkness toward the stable, Marienne remained on the steps longer than she meant to. She blew out the lamp, yet her chest refused to dim the small, unfamiliar stirring that had begun to warm beneath her ribs. Outside, the wind roared, but inside, a small heat had been lit. And because of it, Marienne lay awake for a long, long time. Silas woke before dawn, long before the sky considered turning blue. 20 years of rising early to outrun the heat had carved the habit deep into him. The stable was still dim, holding the soft breath of the gray horse and the thin whistle of wind slipping through the boards. He pulled on his coat and stepped outside, into a yard thick with silver morning haze. The bundle of firewood by the kitchen door held only a few small pieces. He studied it for a moment, breath lifting into the cold air as though he had already decided. Silas crossed to the wall, picked up the axe leaning there, and felt its weight settle into his hand, like something it had known for years. The first strike rang clean through the still dawn, then another and another. The scent of fresh pine spread out into the cold, a sharp, comforting smell that felt both stirring and settling at once. The hinge on the back door clicked. Marienne eased it open, a shawl thrown over her shoulders. She meant to light the stove, but she stopped when she saw Silas in the yard, his figure long against the thinning mist. He was chopping wood. For her. She stood there without speaking, as if her eyes needed a moment to trust what they were seeing. A man awake before the sun, standing in the bite of the cold, thinking of her needs before breakfast. It had been a long time since she'd known what that felt like. Someone remembering her in the smallest way. "You don't have to do that," she called softly. Silas looked up. His dark hair was mussed, beads of frost clinging to his coat. "I'm used to early mornings," he answered, "and I wasn't doing anything else." Marienne felt something tighten in her chest, something old, something new, arriving together and unsettling her. She opened the door wider. "If you don't mind, I have coffee." Silas smiled, a rare expression that eased the harsh lines of his face. No one turns down coffee. Breakfast came with a familiarity that surprised them both. Marienne poured the coffee. Silas added water to the pot. She set cornbread on the table. He slid the salt closer to her hand. The distance from the night before had thinned into a quiet rhythm, gentle, unassuming, like they had shared more time than they truly had. "You always wake up this early?" she asked. "Long roads teach you that. Sleep late and half the day's gone." He took a sip, eyes narrowing slightly at the bitterness. "And you?" "I wake early because I can't sleep. The house is too quiet." Silas's gaze lifted, steady, careful, carrying an understanding she didn't have to explain. He nodded slowly, a gesture that said he heard the part she didn't voice. When breakfast was nearly done, Silas stepped outside at the creak of old wood from the south fence. He walked the line, pressing his hand to the cracked boards, checking a nail already slipping free. "This fence is going," he called. "Needs fixing soon. Animals could get in." Marienne came beside him, their shoulders grazing lightly as they looked at the boards. They both shifted back, but not far. "I know," she said softly, "but I can't do it alone. And I don't want to trouble anyone." Silas ran his hand along the board, testing its give. "I can fix it. Won't take long." "No, I don't want to owe anyone." Her voice tightened, the reflex of a woman who had learned to stand without leaning on anyone for far too long. Silas turned toward her, his eyes gentle in a way that could undo a person. "You won't owe me anything, Marienne. It's a small thing." Said with calm warmth, the words made her look away before her feelings rose too quickly. They began the work without more talk. Silas held the boards. Marienne hammered the nails. Then they switched, she steadying the plank while he drove the nails deeper. At one point, Marienne reached for the hammer at the same moment Silas did. Their hands brushed. Not accidental this time, but slow, warm, the kind of touch that made time pause. Her hand was hot. His was warm, steady. Both drew back, but not as fast as they should have. Marienne bent over the plank, pretending to adjust it. Silas cleared his throat, turning his focus back to the nails. Neither said a word. Yet something had shifted in the bright morning air. Something fragile as mist, strong enough to unsettle the heart. The fence was still old and worn, but in that early light, something inside Marienne had been mended long before the boards were. The days that followed passed in a strange way. No noise, no trouble, nothing dramatic, yet enough to alter the very rhythm of the small house. Silas spoke little about leaving, and Marienne never asked. They both understood, without saying so, that he would stay until the work here was done. Neither of them knew who hoped for that more. Each morning, the sharp sound of an axe carried through the fog before the sun rose. At noon, they worked side by side digging a new trench, guiding what little water remained from the northern creek toward the garden. By afternoon, Silas climbed the old ladder to patch the piece of roof worn thin by last winter's storms. Marienne stood below, holding the ladder, watching him with her head tipped back. Late light cut across his face as he focused on each strike, his weathered cheekbones set firm yet strangely calm. One gust scattered pine needles into his eyes, and before she could think, Marienne reached up to brush away the bead of sweat slipping close to his lashes. A quick gesture, but enough to stop them both. Silas looked down. Their eyes met. A brief moment, but strong enough to make her heart pound, as if she had just heard a sound she had no name for. One evening, they repaired the chicken coop door. Silas tightened the latch while Marienne held the board steady. A draft loosened her shawl, slipping it from her shoulder. Before she noticed, Silas reached to fix it, gently, as if afraid to startle her. His fingers grazed the edge of her collar. Not intentional, yet not entirely accidental. "Thank you," Marienne murmured. He only nodded and kept working, though the tips of his ears reddened in the fading daylight, a detail she noticed but kept to herself. At night, they spread the water map across the table and lit a single oil lamp. Warm yellow light softened the worn paper, and the two of them leaned so close their breaths seemed to settle in the same place. "Here," Silas said, pointing to a rough line. "If we widen this section, the water should reach the garden." "But this rock is big," she said, touching a marked circle. "I tried digging around it." "It'll be different with me here," Silas replied. Simple words, yet enough to make her breath falter. They looked at each other from too close a distance. The lamp flame shimmered in his eyes, giving away a patience and something deeper she refused to name. Marienne turned away, smoothing the map again. But her heartbeat would not settle, and somewhere along the days, laughter returned to the house. On the 7th day, Silas told a story from his years in Montana, how a calf had knocked him headfirst into a mud puddle in front of a group of new cowhands. Marienne burst into real laughter, a sound so rare that even she startled herself. Without meaning to, her hand landed on his arm, as if holding on to the joy just born from the story. Silas looked at her hand, and when she pulled away, he said quietly, "It's been a long time since I've heard someone laugh like that." The words softened her heart like rain gathering on leaves. On the 14th night, dinner ran late. Darkness stretched thick outside, broken only by the hum of insects, and the lamp casting a small circle of warmth. Silas sat in the chair Elijah used to favor, not to take anything from the past, only because it was the sturdiest spot. Marienne stood at the wash basin, drying her hands. When she turned, she saw Silas watching the fire, his face steady, shaped like a stretch of land finally resting after a long storm. In that moment, whether it was the lamp glow or her own heart, she saw him differently. Not a stranger, not a wanderer, but someone who warmed the room by simply being in it. The light caught the thin scar running along his jaw, something she had never asked about, but suddenly wanted to know many things about him. Silas looked up and met her stare. Neither spoke, but something inside Marienne tightened, a small pulse of a new life rising for the first time. And she, more than anyone, feared that feeling. Yet she couldn't look away from him. The news came at noon, under a hard streak of sunlight, when Silas returned from town. His gray horse moved slower than usual, as if it sensed the weight sitting in its rider's chest. Marienne was washing tools in the yard when he stopped at the porch, a small envelope worn at the edges in his hand. "The stable owner in Portland," Silas said, his voice lower than usual. "He wants to talk to me about a job." Marienne froze, the water running in a thin line over the dry ground. "What kind of job?" "Managing the stables, caring for the horses, keeping the books. Something I know how to do." He forced a small smile that never reached his eyes. "More settled than drifting. Room on the upper floor." Marienne tried to keep her voice steady, though her heart slipped a beat. "And what are you thinking?" Silas held her gaze longer than he needed to, as if his answer depended on something she had not said. "I haven't decided," he said. "Not sure. I want to leave this place." This place. She understood he didn't mean only the land. She bent over the tools again, washing the same one twice, anything to hide her face. But Silas stayed where he was, watching her as if trying to read a truth she was keeping behind her eyes. That evening, they worked more quietly than usual. Silas cut boards. Marienne gathered dry grass. They didn't speak much. The western wind carried the smell of damp earth, the early warning of a summer storm. By sunset, Marienne lit the oil lamp and stepped onto the porch. The air held the scent of wet grass and fresh-cut wood. Silas was sitting on the steps, hands resting loosely over his knees, as if wrestling with something he didn't know how to name. She walked over and sat beside him. "Do you think it's good for you?" she asked. "I don't know," Silas admitted. "I've been on the road too long, settling somewhere. Maybe that's what I should do." He glanced at her slowly. "But I'm not sure I want to settle in Portland." A stronger gust swept across the porch, lifting a loose curl of Marianne's hair. It brushed the back of Silas's hand, a touch so light it should have been nothing, yet both of them felt it. Silas drew a breath. "Marianne." She turned. The lamp lit the lines on his face, revealing all the years he carried and all the honesty still left in him. "If you needed me," he paused, as if finishing the thought would break something fragile. "I could stay close." The night wind chilled the porch, sharper than usual, but in that moment it felt like the space between them tightened until it held only enough room for the two of them to breathe. Marianne didn't answer, not because she had nothing to say, but because any word was too dangerous for a heart that had only opened by half. Instead, she looked at him, longer than she ever had. Long enough for Silas to see something true in her eyes. A quiet plea, unspoken yet unmistakable. Silas lowered his head slightly, accepting the answer she wasn't able to voice. "I understand," he murmured. The sky darkened faster than either expected. Heavy clouds gathered in the south, as if they had been waiting for this exact moment to surge forward. A hard gust struck the porch, tilting the lamp flame sideways. Marianne rose quickly. "It's going to pour. We should go in." Silas stood too, but his gaze stayed on her. Something in what had passed between them made it harder for him to turn away. A streak of lightning tore across the sky. Thunder rolled through the valley, deep and close, bringing the smell of wet earth in a rising wave. Marianne pulled her shawl tight. Silas glanced toward the stable. "This storm's a bad one," he said. "I need to check the latch on the stall door." "I'll come." "No." Silas shook his head. "Rain like this, you should get inside." But before she could step in, another crack of thunder shook the ground, and wind slammed the porch roof hard enough to make the beams quiver. Silas stared at the wall of black sweeping toward them, something sharp and certain settling in his eyes. This storm. It was coming faster, harder, and carrying more than either of them had guessed. And it would be the night that changed everything. The rain fell without warning, a thick curtain swallowing the whole valley in an instant. From the porch, Marianne barely caught sight of Silas rushing into the downpour, his form fading into the wind-driven sheets of water. The storm slammed against the roof, thunder rumbling deep enough to shake the ground. She stood there, hands clasped tight, waiting for him to return. A moment later, the door burst open. Silas stepped in, rain streaming from his hair, running down the collar of his shirt, soaking the wooden floor beneath him. He stood there catching his breath, as if he had fought the storm itself just to come back to her. "You're soaked," Marianne said, her voice trembling from worry more than cold. Silas let out a rough, uneven laugh. "The stable's fine, but the wind is strong." Without hesitation, Marianne grabbed the coarse towel hanging near the stove, then went to her room for a set of Elijah's clothes, the old flannel shirt he used every winter. Holding it made her heart halt for a beat. It had been a long time since she touched anything of Elijah's without feeling sharp grief. But tonight, it felt different. She held the shirt out. "Change into this. In the next room. If you stay like that, you'll fall ill." Silas hesitated. "Marienne, I don't know if it's all right." She cut in gently, firmly. "Elijah wouldn't mind." Silas searched her eyes for a long second, then nodded. When he returned, Marienne nearly dropped the bowl in her hands. Elijah's shirt, too broad at the shoulders, a little short at the cuffs, somehow made Silas look settled in this house, as if he had belonged here all along and only needed a storm to step inside. Warmth rose in her chest, part ache, part opening. A past sorrow brushed the present, but it no longer carried the same sharp edge. "Sit by the fire," she said softly. "You're chilled." Silas took a seat across from her. The fire cracked and breathed heat into the room, softening the storm's howl outside. His wet curls began to dry, falling in loose waves over his forehead. They sat quietly. Only the rain, their breaths, and the soft thud of two hearts in a small wooden room. "You hurt your hand this afternoon," Silas said, eyes lowered to her knuckles. "May I see?" Startled, she offered her hand. His thumb ran gently along the small scratch across her skin. Slow, careful, a simple touch, yet it seemed to reach into every year she had tended her own wounds alone. Every winter of cold nights, every quiet ache with no one to notice. Her eyes blurred, tears rising before she could fight them. Silas looked up instantly. "Marienne." She pressed her lips together, but the tremor in her breath gave her away. He saw everything. The exhaustion, the loneliness, the empty spaces she had been living with for too long. Silas lifted his hand, pausing as if asking permission, then brushed her cheek, soft as a falling leaf. "You don't have to be strong by yourself," he said, voice low and true. Marienne closed her eyes. In the rain's pounding rhythm, that sentence cracked the wall she had spent years holding up. When she opened her eyes again, Silas was still watching her, wearing Elijah's flannel, shoulders square and steady, a sight that tightened and eased her heart all at once. Then slowly, as if both feared breaking the moment, they leaned toward each other. Their lips met, not rushed, not hungry, just a trembling kiss between two adults who had carried more loss than most people speak about. Silas rested his forehead against hers. "I'm here," he whispered. She placed her hand on his chest, feeling the strong, steady beat beneath her palm, close enough to dizzy her. Neither spoke after that. They simply held each other before the fire, their warmth blending in the storm-washed night, her emptiness easing under his presence, his wandering finding a place to rest. The closeness unfolded slowly, gently, two souls leaning into each other after long, cold seasons. Not out of longing, but out of the need to be touched, to trust, to feel alive again. Outside, the storm raged, but inside the small house there was only breath and warmth, and Silas's voice, soft as a prayer, repeating once more, "I'm here, Marienne." Marienne woke when the first thin line of light slipped through the worn curtain. The storm had long passed. Only the soft shine of wet earth and the scent of rain-soaked soil drifted in through the window. She lay still for a moment, the faint warmth lingering on her shoulder, making her heart tremble like the first morning of a different life. She didn't hear Silas's horse, She didn't hear the creak of the stable door, and that was the first thing that frightened her. What if he had left? What if the storm had been only a moment, gone as quickly as it came? When she stepped into the main room, she saw Silas crouched by the stove, coaxing a new flame from last night's embers. Elijah's shirt was folded neatly beside him, and he was dressed again in his own clothes, hair dry and slightly tousled. Silas heard her footsteps and turned. They both froze, caught in a silence so shy the whole room seemed to hold its breath. "Good morning," he said first, his voice rough but gentle. "Good morning," she replied, head bowing slightly to hide the smile she couldn't keep down. They both remembered the storm, but neither dared touch it with words. Breakfast was eggs, cornbread, and coffee, and both of them were more awkward than they'd ever been. Marienne dropped her spoon once, clinked the edge of her cup twice, and Silas, trying to act unbothered, drank his coffee too calmly, though the faint red glow in his ears gave him away. Finally, Silas broke the quiet. "Marienne." He set his cup down slowly. "About last night, I don't regret it. Not even a little." She drew a long, steady breath. "I don't either." Their eyes held, fully this time. No hesitation, no shrinking away. "I've been thinking," Silas went on, "I could stay in Oregon, work steady in town. If you wouldn't mind." "You want to be near me?" Marianne asked. Her voice was soft, but honest. Silas didn't dodge. "I do. I don't want to go far anymore." She turned toward the window, afraid to look directly at the thing she had quietly longed for far too long. But his words settled into her chest like the first sunlight after a long winter. "I'm scared," she whispered. "Scared to open my heart and lose again." Silas rose and walked to her. He didn't touch her. He simply stood close, solid, real, and without pressure. "I can't promise the future," he said, his voice low, "but I can promise one thing. I want to be here, with you, if you'll let me." The trembling inside her shifted into something small but firm. "You work 5 days in town," she said, quiet but steady. "Come back here on weekends." Silas smiled, a smile that lit his whole face as if 10 years of drifting had fallen away. "Then I'll rent a room in town." "No," she cut in, cheeks warming. "You can leave your things here, just for convenience." Silas stared at her for a long moment. "For convenience," he echoed, though his voice wrapped gently around her heart. From that day on, the signs were small but unmistakable. Marienne's cornbread tasted better than the first day he came, not because she tried to impress him, but because she found herself waiting for the sound of his horse every weekend. Silas left his small pocket knife in the kitchen. "Use it," he said simply. But Marienne knew it was a piece of his life placed quietly into hers. A shirt hung on the porch rail, purposefully forgotten. A second cup of coffee always poured and waiting, even when she still slept. Each detail was a soft step forward, a promise without words, a new heartbeat inside a house that had once held too much silence. One afternoon, as Silas prepared to head back to town, they stood on the porch, the very place he had first appeared. The breeze carried the scent of grass still sweet from the recent rain. Silas spoke gently. "If you'd rather I don't, I won't take your hand." Marienne looked at his hand, broad, strong, calloused. Then she lifted her own, placing it into his without trembling. I don't mind. Silas closed his fingers around hers, just enough to hold, not enough to claim. Not hiding, not retreating, not under storm-dark skies, but in plain daylight, honest and steady. And from that moment on, nothing between them was the same. Autumn arrived quietly, the way good things usually find their way back to hearts that have endured long enough. The birch leaves in the front yard turned gold, then drifted down one by one across the small cabin roof. Neither of them said it aloud, but they both felt it. The ranch was changing, not only because of the season, but because of the man who had ridden into this place on a dusty afternoon. Silas kept his word, working in town 5 days a week, returning every Friday evening. And each week, without fail, Marienne stood on the porch, clutching her old shawl, listening for the familiar rhythm of his horse coming up the road. Every time he appeared, the yard seemed brighter. Under Silas's hands, the ranch truly came back to life. He fixed the stable roof, raised 2 new support posts, dug another trench to carry more water to the fields. Marienne's garden, once sparse and tired, grew green and strong now that 2 pairs of hands tended it. One Saturday afternoon, he returned from town with a sack of seeds and a roll of deep blue fabric. For you, he said, placing the cloth in her hands. Marienne blinked in surprise. Silas, why? I saw the color and thought it suited you, if you want to make a dress. She ran her fingers across the fabric, smooth, sturdy, beautiful, something she hadn't bought for herself in years. Her chest tightened, as if a thread had pulled from the past into the present and quietly tied itself to Silas. She spoke softly. Thank you. Silas dipped his head, but his eyes held the steady look of a man setting his heart down at her door. Gently, without pressure. That night, the sky was clear. After a simple supper, they took the oil lamp and walked to the northern fence to check the posts. Darkness crept in slowly, the lamplight glowing warm against the bronze ground. A cool wind brushed through Marienne's hair, making her pull her shawl close. Silas walked beside her, his warmth closing the space between them with every breath. I think the fence will hold through winter, he said quietly. Marienne nodded, though her eyes stayed on the shadow his body cast across the earth. Inside her was a strange feeling, peaceful, yet full of waiting. At the end of the fence, near the bend of the little creek, Silas stopped. He set the oil lamp on a post. His breath trembled lightly, as if the wind had shifted inside him. Marienne, he said. She turned and froze. Silas was kneeling, one knee on the ground, awkward in posture but honest in a way that closed her throat. I'm not a young man, Silas began, voice low and unsteady. I'm not wealthy. I have only these hands, and a life already worn past its halfway mark. The oil lamp flickered. A small reflection trembled in his eyes. But I know one thing for certain, he went on. From the day I rode onto this land, you became home to me, the place I want to return to, no matter how far I go. Marienne lifted a hand to her mouth, holding back the sound breaking in her chest. Silas opened his palm. A small silver ring rested inside. Simple, unadorned, clearly something he had saved every spare dollar to buy. You don't have to answer tonight, he said. But if you'd allow it, I want to call this place home. With you. No flowery words, only the truth of a man who had wandered half his life and, for the first time, wished to stop. Tears slid down Marianne's cheeks, not out of sorrow nor grief, but because something new had opened inside her, gentle as a first breath after an old wound has finally closed. She stepped closer and placed her hand on his cheek, making him look directly into her eyes. "Silas Turner," she whispered, "I've wanted you to stay for a long time." Silas's eyes closed briefly. A man finally hearing the answer his heart had waited through too many seasons to receive. "Then," he asked, voice tight, "you'll say yes?" Marianne nodded, this time without trembling, without fear, knowing her heart was opening to the right person at the right moment. Silas rose and pulled her into his arms, warm, steady, the scent of autumn grass, fresh lumber, and his familiar closeness wrapped around her. She cried, but they were the tears of someone living again. That night, when Silas bedded down in the stable out of habit, he took out paper and pen under the small lantern. "Mr. Chester," he wrote, "your son once said he would always keep moving, but I believe I have found something I never expected. A place to call home, a person to build a future with." And beneath his name, with a hand that shook only a little, Silas Turner added two simple words: "Found it." Winter came early that year, carrying a soft chill like a shawl woven from the Oregon sky. And in that same winter, Marianne Holt stood before the mirror for the first time with the deep blue fabric draped along her figure, the cloth Silas had given her months before. She had sewn the dress herself, with the same hands that once hammered fence posts, dug trenches, and held a dying husband through long nights of illness. Now those hands trembled with a tender joy she didn't know where to hide. Morning light spilled through the window, striking the rich blue of the dress, until it seemed to breathe on its own. Marianne touched the sleeve, where she had stitched a small sprig of flowers, a detail Elijah once loved. Not to cling to grief, but to tell herself that past and present could stand side by side without fighting each other anymore. On the wedding morning, Portland was livelier than usual. The old white church on the corner was decorated with fresh pine branches brought by local families. Nothing extravagant, nothing loud. Just the simple presence of people who had seen Silas and Marianne pass through town, who had heard murmurs of how two lives slowly found each other. Silas waited by the church gate, smoothing the old vest he had polished late into the night. It was far from new, but it suited him strangely well, as if every crease in the fabric told a piece of the road that led him to this day. He was nervous enough to comb his hair with his fingers again and again, though the strands refused to fall into place. Then he heard her steps on the wooden stair. He turned. And the world, the murmurs of townsfolk, the church bell, even the long years of wandering, faded into nothing. There was only her. Marianne stood there in the blue dress she'd made with her own hands, her hair pinned back with a matching ribbon. No jewelry, no veil. But the look in her eyes, deep, calm, made Silas's heart stop. "You're beautiful," he breathed, the words slipping out like a confession. She blushed, smiling shyly. "I only hope it goes well with your vest." They walked inside together, hand brushing hand, not holding, just touching, but enough to send warmth up both their spines, like a new current of life arriving under their skin. The ceremony was simple. The old pastor spoke in a voice worn by the years. There were no flowers carpeting the aisle, no choir, No tears cried aloud. But there were bright eyes, clasped hands, and rows of quiet smiles. When Silas slid the rough silver ring onto Marianne's finger, the church went still, the gentle stillness of dawn in early winter. "I choose you," Silas said, abandoning the scripted lines, speaking only what his heart had carried for months. Marianne answered with a smile no one had seen on her face since Elijah died. "And I choose you." And just as the pastor declared them husband and wife, the first snowflakes of the season began to fall outside, tiny, bright, and soft as feathers. The townsfolk called it a blessing. Silas only knew that the very first flake drifted down the moment he took his wife's hand and walked her out of the church. Back at the ranch, the familiar wooden house felt completely different. No longer a place fought over for survival, but the beginning of a life built by two. Silas lifted Marianne over the doorway, not by tradition, but because the evening before the wedding, he had repaired the threshold himself, wanting the door that welcomes her home to stand firm. Marianne laughed in his arms, gripping his vest. "I spent half my life not knowing joy could feel like this." Silas set her down gently in the warm living room where the fire glowed low. "And for the rest of your life," he whispered, "I won't let you forget." Outside, snow fell thicker, covering old footprints. Inside, Marianne walked through the house not as a woman struggling to hold everything together, but as someone finally free to imagine a future, one she would build with the man who chose to stay. Not clinging to the past, not fearing loss, only stepping forward with the man who made this place home. Winter arrived like an uninvited guest who crossed the mountains too quickly. Snow began falling at the end of December, and soon the entire valley lay under a thick, unmoving white, as if the wind itself could not lift such heavy cold. Silas had never seen an Oregon winter this unforgiving. The cold carved straight through his coat, and each breath turned to dense smoke the moment it left his mouth. Every time he stepped out to check the horses, it felt as though the sun had forgotten this place entirely. Inside, Marianne tried to keep her days steady, lighting the fire, cooking stew, sewing loose gloves. But only a few weeks after the wedding, her body began to change. She tired easily, grew breathless, and sometimes had to sit down mid-task because the room spun. Silas saw it immediately. He wasn't a man who noticed everything, but the fatigue in her face was something he could not ignore. "I'm fine," she always said, smiling just enough to keep him from worrying. But one afternoon, as he fed the stove, he heard the crash of dishes from the kitchen, a sound sharp enough to stop his heart. Silas ran. Marianne was on the floor, one hand bracing against the table as if she had tried to catch herself. Her face was pale, her breath thin. "Marianne!" He dropped to his knees, pulling her into his arms, fear scraping his voice raw. "Can you hear me? Marianne!" She opened her eyes, whispering, "I just got dizzy." He couldn't hear anything over the storm groaning outside, like the wind itself was crying out. Lifting her gently, he carried her to the bed, then grabbed his coat with shaking hands. "I'm going for the doctor." His voice broke in the middle. Don't close your eyes." Dr. Carmichael arrived long after dark. Snow clung to his coat, his gloves soaked, but his eyes remained sharp behind the lamplight. Silas waited in the hallway, unable to stand still, his hand clamped on the doorframe until his knuckles went white. When the doctor finally stepped out, Silas shot upright like someone awaiting a verdict. "How is she? Is she Is she in danger? Not in danger, the doctor said slowly. But she needs rest and proper food. Silas nodded hard, relief almost knocking him off his feet. Then the doctor paused, softened his voice, and said, "And congratulations, Turner. Your wife is expecting." Silence. A silence so deep even the wind outside sounded like someone whispering through the snow. Silas didn't move. A single, startling feeling rose in him, like he had stepped into another world without warning. "You're certain?" His voice was barely a breath, afraid to hope. The doctor smiled. "Very certain. But she's weak. The early winter won't be easy." Silas nodded again, but his eyes glowed like a new fire catching. "Thank you," he whispered. When the doctor left, Silas returned to the bedroom. Marienne lay beneath the lamplight, her pale face touched with warmth when she saw him come in. "Silas." Her voice was small, like the sound of snow touching the ground. He sat beside her and took her hand, and for the first time his own hand trembled, not from cold. "Are you all right?" She looked into his eyes, and he saw what she didn't dare say. She was frightened. After a long moment, she whispered, "Am I going to be okay?" He squeezed her hand. "You're not in danger," he said gently. "You only need rest." She tried to smile, but her smile carried both hope and uncertainty. Then her eyes widened, remembering something the doctor had said. "Silas, I—" He nodded, placing his palm softly against her cheek. "I know." The first tear slipped from Marianne's lashes, not because of pain, not because of fear, but because this possibility she thought her life had long closed the door on, had found its way to her again. "I'm scared," she whispered. "I'm scared it will be like last time." Silas leaned forward, resting his forehead against hers so she could feel his breath, calm, steady, pointed toward her. "I'm here," he murmured. "There is nothing we won't face together." Then he placed his hand on her belly, lightly, reverently, as though touching something sacred. They stayed that way in silence. Only the wind outside and the rhythm of two hearts finding the same beat. "Thank you," Silas whispered at last. "Thank you for giving me the chance to be a father." Outside, snow fell heavier, but inside that room another season began. One of waiting, one of hope, one of quiet, trembling joy. Spring arrived late that year, but it carried a joy neither of them had ever dared to dream of. In the small wooden room beneath the dim lamplight and the scent of herbs, the first cry of their child echoed, small, weak, but persistent, as if declaring to the world that he had survived the harsh winter just to reach them. Silas froze where he stood. His whole body trembled as the midwife laid the tiny baby into his arms. A small, soft body, warm brown skin, hands no larger than new leaves. And when the eyes opened, they looked uncannily like Marianne's. "It's a boy," the midwife smiled. "A healthy little boy." Silas needed a long moment to find his breath. Then he smiled, not wide but deep enough to change every line of his face. "Look," he whispered toward the bed. "Marienne, our son." Marienne, exhausted but radiant, reached out her trembling hand to touch the baby's cheek. Tears slipped down her face, not from pain, but because fate had given her a miracle she once believed she would never hold again. In the weeks that followed, the house once accustomed to wind and creaking wood filled with new sounds, crying, cooing, Silas dropping towels, and Marianne's quiet, uncontrollable laughter whenever he tried to manage things like a man relearning how to live. Silas, who knew how to tie reins in a storm, ride over rocky hills, and repair a roof with 2 nails, could not fold a diaper without trapping the baby's legs inside. "Are you sure you can handle this alone?" Silas muttered, rubbing his forehead as the diaper fell to the floor for the 3rd time. Marianne laughed softly, standing by the bed. "You can. Just don't tie it like you're saddling a horse." Silas flushed, tried again, and this time the diaper stayed in place. He let out a quiet laugh, a rare sound, like wind sweeping across an open field. "See that?" he whispered to the baby. "Your father learned something today." The baby yawned, as if in approval. By summer, Silas had expanded the farm. A new stable rose beside the old one. The irrigation ditch deepened, and for the first time in years, the harvest was far better than either expected. Marianne stood on the porch, their baby in her arms, watching Silas stack sacks of grain into the barn. His face was sun-worn, but his eyes shone with the certainty of a man who had finally found the right life. "Look at this," Silas called out, voice loud with joy. "We'll have enough for winter." Marianne smiled, leaning her cheek against the baby's soft hair. "Because of you." "Because of us," Silas corrected gently, stepping over to place his hand on both of them. "Our family." Those 2 words tightened something beautiful inside her chest. One early autumn evening, after a long day of work, Silas sat in the rocking chair by the fireplace, the baby asleep on his chest. The firelight danced across the child's dark curls, traced the straight bridge of Silas's nose, and warmed the large hands holding the baby as though they were holding the entire world. Marianne stood in the doorway, watching them. She didn't call out. She didn't want to disturb the rare peace that filled the room. Silas wasn't fully asleep. He only nodded softly, breathing slow and steady, like a man who had finally found something he never knew he needed. After a long while, Marianne stepped closer. She didn't speak. She simply picked up an old quilt, the one her mother had sewn when she was a child, the same quilt that had covered those she had loved and lost. She unfolded it gently and laid it across Silas's shoulders and the baby's small body. The worn fabric touched them both, linking past to present, loss to new beginnings. Silas opened his eyes slightly, a smile tugging at his lips. "You always know when we need this quilt." Marianne sat beside him, her fingers brushing his hand. "I know when my family needs warmth," she said softly. Outside, the early autumn wind rustled through the trees. Inside, the old quilt, once a symbol of those who had left her, now wrapped around those who had come into her life. A new family, a new thread of hope, a joy neither of them had expected, but one they now held close. 10 years passed like a chain of seasons stitched softly together. No noise, no great storms, just layers of sun, layers of rain, layers of soil turned and tended by 2 people who chose to stop running and stay beside each other. The Holt-Turner Ranch had become a familiar name around Portland. Sturdy horse stalls, a straight water channel, a vegetable garden 3 times bigger than before, and a grain barn that never ran empty through winter. Everything on this land carried the mark of Silas and Marianne. Every fence post was a late afternoon they had stood shoulder to shoulder. Every harvest held her smile and his soft whistle. Every step on the porch held stories of those who came before, and those now growing inside this home. After their first son, 3 more children came. A girl named Clara, bright-eyed and fearless as summer wind. A mischievous boy, Henry, who adored horses just like Silas. And little Samuel, gentle and quiet, always curling into Marianne's lap at night for stories. The small wooden house once made for 2 now held 2 extra rooms, a new kitchen, and a back porch for drying corn. Each morning, the sound of little feet running across the floor made Silas laugh even on the hardest days. Marienne changed too. No longer the thin, solitary woman on the old porch he first saw. Now she was strong, full of life, her eyes always bright when watching the children play. Yet on long winter nights, when Silas slept beside her, she still remembered Elijah and the child she once lost. Not with pain, but with a soft kind of memory, like touching the edge of a folded cloth tucked deep in a drawer. She knew it would always remain, but no longer heavy. Silas understood. He never asked, never pressed. He simply took her hand in the dark, quietly, without trying to fix or replace the past, just being there. That was how Marienne knew she had chosen right in this life. As the children grew, the ranch became a resting place for many. Farmers coming from the valley to ask about irrigation, horse owners seeking Silas's help, and townswomen stepping into the kitchen to learn Marienne's cornbread. They were never rich in the way people usually meant, but they were full in ways neither had ever expected to be again. Time continued its steady pace. One summer afternoon, Marienne realized their eldest wanted to apprentice in town. Clara ran after dreams of breaking horses like her father, and Henry and Samuel no longer clung to her skirts. The house grew quieter, wider. Door frames seemed taller each evening, and in that soft emptiness, Marienne understood. The years spent raising children were a short season, one every mother must learn to let go of. That evening, summer wind drifted through the window carrying the warm scent of earth. Silas sat in the old rocking chair, the same chair where he once fell asleep holding their firstborn, now dozing again, a notebook about the horses still in his hand. Strands of silver glinted in his hair beneath the lamp. Marienne stood at the threshold for a long moment, watching him. This man who had walked through so many dusty seasons, only to end his wandering here, in the place she once thought she would spend the rest of her life alone. She walked toward him, slow and careful, as though not to disturb the quiet. Then she opened the cupboard and took out the old quilt, the one her mother had sewn, the one that had wrapped the child she lost, the one that had warmed Elijah, the one that had covered Silas and their baby on a far-off winter night. She draped it gently over Silas's shoulders, then pulled it down to cover his legs. The quilt lay over him like a long blessing, a thread connecting those who had gone and those who remained. Silas shifted slightly, but did not wake. Marienne placed a hand on his shoulder and whispered, as though speaking to her whole life, "Love doesn't erase the past. It simply turns it into the ground we build a new life upon." Outside, the summer wind moved through the trees. Inside, all the old seasons, sorrow, loss, hope, seemed to settle quietly beneath that quilt, slowly blending into a future still stretching long before them. Thank you, dear aunts and uncles, for staying with the story until the final moment. If it brought you a bit of warmth, a bit of understanding, or stirred something gentle in your memories, I would be honored if you shared a thought below. And please don't forget to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next quiet, tender tale, just enough to warm a long afternoon.